I was still standing by the kitchen counter counting the cash from my paycheck when Dad walked in like he owned every breath I ever took. He didn't even ask how my day was. He just eyed the money like it belonged to him by blood default. Mom leaned back against the fridge with her coffee, swirling it slow like she was already spending my hours of labor inside her head. "How much is that?" Mom asked casually without looking at me. "Enough for rent and groceries this month," I said, sliding the envelope into my purse. Mom's eyebrows shot up like I said something offensive. "Rent? Groceries? For what?" "Your sister needs new outfits for her modeling campaign. You can do rent next month." "I already told you," I answered quietly. "I'm not giving the money this time. I already paid your bills last month." Dad stepped closer, like I just spit on their family crown. "You think this conversation is optional?" he said sharply. "You think because you have a job, you get to decide something now?" My heartbeat thudded in my throat. I held onto my purse tighter. "This is my salary," I repeated, voice low. "I need to survive too." He didn't even pause to think. He punched me straight in the stomach. Hard, not a slap, not a shove. A full punch. Fast, violent, direct, like knocking breath out of me was a normal way to reset my place in the family food chain. I folded forward instantly, air ripped out of my lungs, my knees hitting the cold tile. My ears rang, my face felt hot. A sick wave crawled up my chest as I grabbed the counter to keep from collapsing completely. Mom didn't flinch. Mom didn't gasp. Mom didn't say stop. She actually smiled a little, sipping her coffee like she was watching a scene that matched her morning mood. Dad leaned down near my ear and said calmly, "Pain teaches animals not to disobey the chosen one." I didn't say a word. I froze, stone still, letting breath crawl back slow, because I knew if I screamed, he'd hit again, and again, and again. My sister Ava walked in smirking, tossing her long hair like some movie character. "Dad, don't break her too much. She still needs to work next week. We need new heels before photo shoot day." Mom laughed lightly and crossed her arms. "She'll give them money. She just likes pretending she matters." I sat there on the floor in silence, holding my stomach, feeling pain surge through every rib, not because of the strike, but because they actually believed every single word they were saying. I stood up slowly, breathing through sharp pain shooting across my side. Nobody even asked if I was okay. Nobody checked if I could stand straight. Nobody even cared enough to look directly at me. They only stared at the envelope. I placed my purse on my shoulder and walked toward the door. Dad said behind me, "Come back inside and hand that money over before this turns ugly." I didn't turn around. I walked out with my hand on my side, still struggling to breathe. Their laughter followed me like a shadow that never asked if I wanted company. Outside in the driveway, the cold air hit me like a slap of reality. I sat in my car, holding my stomach with one hand and gripping the steering wheel with the other. My eyes burned, but no tears fell. The pain wasn't physical anymore. It was the realization of just how replaceable I truly was to them. A disposable labor source. An animal that brings money, not a daughter. I drove away. And in that silent drive, through the slow evening streets, I realized something terrifying and clear for the first time in my entire life. If I didn't change this now, they would own my existence forever. They weren't just stealing money. They were stealing who I was allowed to be. That night was the first time I ever let myself imagine a world where they didn't get to choose my suffering anymore. I didn't know how yet, but I knew revenge in this story wouldn't be quiet, and I wasn't going to be their animal anymore. I didn't go home for 3 days after that night. I slept in my car the first night behind an old closed-down bakery, then at my coworker Lila's couch the next 2. I didn't tell her anything. I just said I needed space from family stress. She didn't ask questions. Sometimes kindness is silent and doesn't need a backstory. I went to work with slow breaths, moving the way you move when every muscle in your core aches from being hit. Sitting down hurt, standing too long hurt, laughing hurt, even thinking about breathing deep hurt. But what hurt worse than all of that was the thought of going back into that house and letting them teach me my place again. On the 4th morning, my phone buzzed with a message from Dad. "Bring salary back today." 6 p.m. No attitude this time. 5 minutes later, Mom. And bring the card too. We're going shopping. Your sister needs outfits for her campaign. Do not be selfish. Then, my sister sent a voice note. You should feel honored. Your money is going to something beautiful and not wasted on your boring survival. Dad said you're embarrassing us with all this independence nonsense. I stared at the messages and felt something in me shift. Not break. Shift. A calmness. A dangerous calmness. A clarity. They genuinely believed I was property. That their comfort automatically outranked anything I could ever want. They didn't even consider that I was a human being with my own bills, my own pain, my own right to breathe. They believed I didn't get to say no. That night, instead of going home, I booked the smallest studio apartment I could find and signed the rental contract with my remaining pay. The place was tiny, 1 room, cement floor, a single window facing a brick wall. But when I stepped inside, I felt air in my lungs I had never tasted before. Air without permission. Air that didn't belong to someone else. I sat on the floor and cried. Quietly, not because of pain, but because this was the first oxygen in my life that didn't come attached to humiliation. At 6 p.m., my father called 6 times. Then my mom called 8 times. Then my sister started texting threats, manipulation, guilt. I didn't answer any of them. By 9 p.m., they switched to rage. You think you can survive without us? You think you get to decide anything? Bring the money now, or you will regret this for the rest of your life. I muted them. The silence felt like power I never realized I always had. The next morning at work, my boss pulled me aside gently. Are you all right? You seem stiff, exhausted. I paused. I almost lied. Then something snapped again, in a good way. No, I said quietly. I'm not okay, but I'm fixing it. He nodded and told me HR was available if I ever needed support. That small sentence, you're allowed to fix it. It was something I never heard inside my own home. That night in my new tiny studio, I finally felt like I had a base camp to rebuild myself from. I made a small plan. A real one. I would never again hand money to people who saw me as livestock. I would build savings quietly. I would build my career without them. I would make sure my financial stability became a wall they could never climb again. For the next 6 months, that became my mission. Extra shifts, freelance side gigs online, saving every spare dollar. I didn't go back to my parents' home once. Not a single birthday, not a single gathering, not a single fake apology bait message. I vanished from their world. 6 months in, I was promoted. I became assistant manager. My salary doubled. My life stabilized. I had dignity, peace, control. And the day I got promoted, that exact same night, they suddenly reappeared like clockwork. Mom called first. We need your help financially. Your sister's situation is very stressful. You need to contribute. Family duty, remember? Then, Dad. You're stronger now because of how we raised you. You owe us respect. Bring money tomorrow morning. They said it like nothing happened. Like my ribs never hurt. Like my voice never mattered. Like I was still stuck in their currency cage. I looked at my phone screen. The same hands they once punched now holding power they will never touch again. This is when I realized they never expected I could outgrow them. They believed pain would always control me. They thought I was still that silent girl on the kitchen floor holding her stomach. They didn't understand what they actually taught me that night wasn't obedience, it was independence. And I wasn't done. The final chapter wasn't silence. It wasn't distance. This time, I was going to flip their own rules on them. Now they were the ones who needed permission. Now they were the ones who had to ask. Now it was time for revenge, and it wouldn't be poetic. It would be literal, and they were finally about to learn pain from the other side of the glass. He had always believed the house was a ledger he could balance with my wages. He had never imagined I'd learn how ledgers worked better than he did. I worked until the numbers stopped being vague and became a weapon. I learned invoicing, client relations, contract clauses, the dull art of late fees and holdbacks. I learned which forms made a payroll release and which signatures meant a check would be held for review. I practiced those things quietly, like someone who was building a lock for a door that had once slammed on her. A year after I left, I sat in a glass-walled conference room with the company logo on the wall behind me. I'd been promoted twice in 6 months, not because I wanted status, but because I wanted leverage. I watched a slideshow of vendor reports and realized with a small, cold thrill that the firm handling Ava's campaign contracts used our platform to process vendor payments. They relied on our approvals to release creative fees and to book studio time. Their project manager called our operations desk every week for date confirmations and deposit releases. They needed us. Ava called me that morning, breathless excitement in her voice. "Mom says the glossy shoot is confirmed. We need the deposit released so the studio will hold the date. Can you?" Her voice trailed into that old expectation. "You will help because blood says you owe." I pretended not to hear the tone I had learned to hate. I asked simple questions instead: dates, deliverables, signed release forms. She stammered. The agency had told her to submit vendor invoices, signed model release, insurance certificate. She didn't have them because Mom had been at the boutique all week and Dad forgot to file the insurance payment. They had assumed I would fix it. When the call ended, I opened the file on my screen. Ava's campaign packet came up, but the insurance certificate field was blank. The deposit release workflow flagged missing compliance documents. The system would prevent payout until all paperwork was complete. My finger hovered but didn't click override. The override was the power I wanted. The override would let me choose whether their crisis was urgent enough to pierce my resolve. I sat for a long minute and remembered the tile under my knees when I'd been hit. I remembered the way the envelope had looked on the counter like an offering I had to kneel for. I thought about the nights I had built my savings in the little studio where I finally slept without listening for footsteps. I thought about dignity. Then I typed a note into the compliance log. Pending. Confirm insurance. No exceptions per policy. I let the system do the rest. The studio sent a formal hold notice to Ava's agent. The agent emailed our team asking for immediate release because the campaign timeline was tight. I replied with the policy citation and a deadline. They begged. They offered expedited fees. They offered to furnish an alternate certificate within 2 hours. The platform rules were clear. No certificate, no release. No amount of begging changed that. By noon, the house had become a place of sour panic. My mother came to my old neighborhood to drop by, but she found the mail slot empty for me. She left a pile of messages, each dipped in increasing sharpness. Dad called. Ava texted that the studio had canceled and that she had lost the prime spot to another model who had her papers in order. The text read like a gash. We were humiliated. They came to my office because the system had marked my username on the communication chain. They didn't come with apologies. They came with entitlement. Dad stood in my doorway, red with anger, as if the years of abuse had put him on some appointment schedule where he could storm into the life of the person who dared to leave. Mom clutched a shopping bag like it proved some sort of claim on me. Ava clung to her phone, eyes swollen, proof of the world narrowing. "You don't understand," Dad said, voice rough. "You have to release it. You have to help family. Your sister needs this." I let him breathe. I let him make himself feel important. "You think I can just hit a button and fix everything?" I asked, and I kept my voice calm enough to be sharp. "You think I'm a vending machine you can shove coins into whenever you want a favor?" Mom's face flashed anger into shame. "We're your family," she said, the old script playing like a scratched record. "You owe us." "Owe you?" I repeated. "What I owe you is my childhood. What I owe you is silence while you taught me to be small. That was the only debit you ever recorded. You think that gives you a credit on my future? It doesn't." They talked faster, louder, offering reasons that had always worked. Family duty, sacrifice, tradition. I watched them unravel into the way they always did when asked to act like adults. They improvised excuses and blamed logistics and turned compassion into transactions. I pulled up the compliance log and showed Dad the exact entry. Missing insurance certificate, missing signed model release, agency failed to submit. I pointed to the policy link. I explained step by step what was needed and how the company's audit would flag any override as an internal breach, potentially costing me my job. I let the fear of loss hang between us like a mantle. "You can override," Dad said quickly, like a man who had always expected his threats to be currency. "You can do it for us. You owe us." I looked at him and realized he had grown used to threats being enough. He never learned that someone he hurt could learn the language of leverage. He never learned that people he pushed could one day sit behind the glass of a conference room and hold the keys. "No," I said, "I can't. Not without the paperwork." For a moment, it looked like he might strike me where I stood. For a moment, it looked like old violence might find its way into new territory. Then something stranger happened. His bravado folded into pleading. "Please, for once, just this one time." I leaned closer, and my voice was cold. "You punched my stomach for saying no," I said. "You called me an animal. You taught my sister that she was chosen and I was nothing. You turned my life into your convenience store. You want me to be your machine again? Make no mistake. If I release this, it's because every document is in order, not because you screamed louder, not because you begged, because you did the work like adults." Ava made a sound like a child who had been dropped. She went pale. She tugged at Mom's sleeve and said something about how this would ruin their reputation, how some favors couldn't be repaid. I watched her capitulate. Then I did something they had never expected. I handed them a form. It was the checklist the studio required. It had boxes for insurance, model waiver, signed deliverables, and an itemized invoice listing vendors who had been paid. I told them exactly what to do and gave them a realistic timeline. Fix it within 3 business days, then I would reassign a compliance officer to review. No exceptions, no overrides. They stared as if I'd handed them a map to another country. They wanted the instant fix. I offered labor, rules, and a boundary. Work like an adult or lose the prize. The next hours were a frantic storm. They ran to the agency. They tried to borrow money for a last-minute certificate. They made phone calls and promises. They scraped payment plans together, flitted between shops trying to bribe documents into existence. They begged my colleagues. One of our junior coordinators, who had always liked me quietly, even offered to walk them through forms. Mom accepted that help with a hate-filled gratitude. They fixed what they could in a panic. They paid expedited fees. They produced a half-truth certificate that, under audit, would fail. I rejected it. I explained why. I refused to be the back door to their shortcuts. When the deadline passed, they had lost the studio slot and the campaign moved forward with a different model. The public damage wasn't wide. No drama, no feeds, no viral blasts. This was quieter, surgical. Ava missed the exposure she'd banked on. The agency marked her as unreliable. A manager flagged her in the talent roster. Contracts that would have bridged months of lavish bills didn't arrive. The family's cash flow stumbled. They came to me the following week, not with rage, but with something worse. The hollow pleading of people who finally realized they were caught in a life they hadn't built. Dad asked me for a loan. Mom offered a contrite, rehearsed apology. Ava promised to change. I listened. I weighed them with new currency. Terms. "You want help?" I said. "There are conditions." They looked at me like children bargaining for dessert. I laid out a list, small, humiliating for them only in the way of paperwork. Formal apologies in writing, a signed statement that they acknowledged the abuse, a binding agreement that they would no longer request funds or use my name for discounts without signed consent. I asked for proof of insurance payments and vendor receipts for other expenditures they had offloaded onto me over the years. They balked, they argued, then they signed. They signed because they had to. They signed because when they looked at the paper, they saw the consequence of their choices, not in the street, not on a screen, but on their bank ledgers, on campaign bookings, on the quiet ledger of a life that suddenly needed professional compliance. When they left my office, there was no dramatic scream. There was no sobbing finale. There was a thin, electric silence, the kind that follows a wound that hasn't healed because someone pulled the bandage off and the air kissed it raw. I went home that night and unlocked my apartment door with a calm hand. I put the kettle on. The domestic smallness of making tea felt like a victory because it was mine. Outside, my phone buzzed once, a string of messages from Ava about what she'd lost. I read them and then deleted the conversation. There was no satisfying gloat in it. There was a hard, necessary truth. They had learned to take for granted the person who would always make their messes go away. I made sure the messes had to be fixed on their terms now under rules I created, in public, procedural, measured, irreversible. When I turned off the light, the apartment was quiet in a way that wasn't empty. It was occupied by freedom that had a price I'd finally paid. Not in ribs or silence, but in time, in effort, in sober, slow building. And for the first time, I slept without waiting for violence to ring on the other side of the door.